Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear LLSP alumni, welcome to this sixth program of our 2020 Lunch and Learn series. Our guest today is Ms. Raheemah Abdulaleem. Ms. Abdulaleem currently serves as a Deputy General Counsel in the Executive Office of the President, Office of Administration. Previously, she worked as a senior trial attorney for the United States Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, where she litigated employment discrimination cases. During the Obama administration, Ms. Abdulaleem advanced President Obama's criminal justice reform efforts through her service on DOJ's Clemency Initiative. She reviewed federal inmate petitions, the majority from inmates convicted of nonviolent offenses, and made recommendations to the president. This was an important initiative because in the 1990s, there were a series of laws passed that led to mass incarceration for drug offenses. These laws have been changed since then, and these prisoners would have received shorter sentences if sentenced today. Criminal justice reform remains a huge issue in the United States. Ms. Abdulaleem has also provided pro bono, that's to say free, legal services as a child welfare attorney and a voting rights attorney. Ms. Abdulaleem is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Law School. At Harvard Law School, she worked at the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau as a student attorney providing legal services to poor people in the community. Wow. So, Raheemah, you are currently serving as a Deputy General Counsel in the Executive Office of the President, Office of Administration. Tell me a bit about that. How big is your office? How many people do you supervise? What's the focus of your office's work? What branch of government is it a part of? And to whom do you report?
Okay. Well, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first time I've ever said that in an LSP program. Pleasure to be able to engage with you today. I'm glad that we still are able to do this virtually. I would love to have met you all in person. So as Sarah mentioned, I am Deputy General Counsel in the Executive Office of the President. And so just to give you a little bit of background, the Executive Office of the President is basically like an umbrella organization that has 12 different, what we call components. This is in the executive branch of government. Now we're located on what we call the 18 acres or the White House complex, which means that our building is I'm in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, which is like this huge kind of French, it's a French architectural building. You have to look it up, Google it if you've never been. It's some people think it's beautiful, other people think it's not so beautiful, but I think it's kind of a gorgeous building. Within the Executive Office of the President, so remembering that 12 umbrella organization, there are about 2,000 employees total. And in my particular component, which is called the Office of Administration, there are about 200. And of those 200, I'm in the Office of General Counsel, and there are about 10 employees that I supervise. So the Office of General Counsel, we were established to really be, I liken us to, if you imagine a car and there's an engine to the car, the Office of Administration is like the engine to the car, right? We do the important aspects that need to be done. So things like the Chief Financial Officer, we have people under us, mail logistics and management, so facilities and the mail room. So things that make the car go. And so the car being Executive Office of the President as an entity, making sure that it operates. And I am in the General Counsel's office, so I provide all types of employment law advice, fiscal law, administrative law issues, anything that's with respect to procurement. So a lot of the business functions, if you think of it as like a business still needs the nuts and bolts so that it can operate. Now, of the 200 people within my office, Office of Administration, the vast majority, I'm almost 100, probably over 190, 195, are what we call career civil servants. And so what that means is that we serve the institution of the presidency, irrespective of who's in office. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with, how government positions generally work in the United States, you generally have career and you have political appointees. And most federal civil servants fall under that federal civil servant career. They have their job administration through administration. And then the other portion of people are those political appointees who serve at the pleasure of whoever the current president is. I am not one of those people. I am a career civil servant. As I mentioned, one of the areas that I focus on is employment law. So for those who are less familiar, in the 1960s, there were various civil rights concerns going on in the United States. And there was several different laws that were passed, one of them being the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the goal of that act was to make sure that in various areas, such as employment and housing, there was non-discrimination, because people were concerned that there had been just a long history of discriminating against Black people. And these laws have been expanded to apply based on race, based on sex, gender, based on a variety of different national origin, color, what we call protected categories. So that's one of the things that I focus on at work. I feel like I've been talking for a long time. So
no, this is very interesting. Yeah, continue. Yeah, I'm interested to know. I'm just wondering, what is, in terms of a career civil servant, I remember when the poor fellow who took over from Comey as the head of the FBI, and then was fired just literally hours before his pension vested. What's the structure for a career civil servant in terms of the vesting of their pension? Do most people, what's the average length of time that a career civil servant works? And for you, how long exactly have you been on the career civil service path?
So I started in government in 2009. So I did first enter government under the Obama administration. And so that's part, as Sarah mentioned in the intro, the clemency initiative I worked on. Now that was something that when I was at DOJ, we actually had the opportunity to volunteer and do other assignments that were outside of our day-to-day work. And because that was one of that president's initiatives, I was able to do that work on the clemency initiative. And so I've been in government since 2009. So at this point, almost half of it being at DOJ and the other half here at the Executive Office of the President. Now, generally, there's a long process, and sometimes you'll hear people complain about you can't fire government employees. You can fire them, but there generally is a pretty, lengthy process before you can fire them. In contrast to most people who are in the private sector, sometimes you may have heard concepts like at will. And so at will is what a lot of employers, if you don't have a contract and you don't have a contract would basically outline the parameters of your employment. So some people work under contracts which say you're hired, you can only be fired under these conditions. But a large majority of people work and they're considered at will, which means you work at the will of your employer. So if one day you come in and your employer says, it's not working out, today's your last day, a lot of people can just be fired for what we say is any reason, no reason, as long as it's not a discriminatory reason. So even people who are at will, the parameter is that you can be fired for anything as long as it isn't because of your color, your race, your gender, your disability, as long as it's not one of those, what we call protected categories. So in the federal government, there's actually even more rights. And so instead of being at will, we can't just be fired for any reason. There's a process that you have to go through because there's this concept of due process in your employment. So you actually have in the federal government, somewhat of an ownership interest and right in your continued employment. So, an employer has to kind of go through some steps and establish, a variety of factors before they can fire someone who is a career civil servant. So that's one of the things that's a little bit different.
So just to extend that a little bit, do these kinds of protections also apply, let's say, to a congressperson's employees or aides, or are they not covered by these kinds of civil service protections?
They are, and there's various laws that apply to Congress and even to the executive, where I'm at. So so for Congress people, there's something called the Congressional Accountability Act, which
Mhm.
tried to take these concepts under Title VII and apply them to
Mhm.
Congress. And so even where I'm at the executive office, there is something called the Presidential and Executive Accountability Act. And these laws try to marry what was seen as, pieces of the federal law that did not necessarily apply to Congress and the executive office of the president. And so, I think it was I think this was decades ago, that they had these additional laws that said, look, it may have been unclear. And this is oftentimes what happens with laws. People would say, well, look, I'm reading the law and it doesn't look like it applies to A, B, C, or D. So they would have separate laws that would come out and say, well, we want to be clear. This law that protects people from discrimination does apply to people who were in the congressional staff. This does apply to people who are in the executive office of the president.
So it's an attempt to align, I guess, the values that are enshrined in a lot of these laws that were passed since the 1960s and try and make sure that they apply in government as well. So I think that's a really good idea, because otherwise it's a situation of do as we tell you, not as we do. So it's always good to see it aligned. Well, that's good. Now, I know that you remain very involved with your alma mater. So tell me a bit about your continuing relationship with Harvard Law School.
Yeah, well, so I actually in 2015, not 15, 2017, I think, was invited back to Harvard to serve as a faculty member. They have a trial advocacy workshop, and it was established decades ago. And what it basically does is bring back lawyers and judges to the campus to serve as, teachers for this. It's a 3-week intensive course for the students to teach them all kind of trial advocacy skills. And I mean, it's a great way to, work with young students who are, just getting started in law school. Most of them are probably second or third years in law school. And we provide them with tools on, how to get up in court, how to do what's called a direct examination, or how to do a cross-examination. And it's a very intensive course, but it really gives them a great footing for what life could be like after law school. Now, not everyone leaves law school and wants to be, a trial lawyer. But I think the trial advocacy workshop gives people skills that are easily transferable to, any type of law that they may want to pursue later, whether it's corporate or whether it's in a, public defender's office or anything like that. I also try to just, I try to go back to the law school at least once a year, and I talk to current students about career opportunities and share different perspectives of how they can remain engaged in areas that they're passionate about. And I think that that's one of the things I want to share with you all, because oftentimes, through life, people may have to make certain decisions for maybe where you work, like what your day job is. And you may feel like, oh my gosh, I really want to pursue this academic interest, or maybe I want to continue doing, even for example, with KARAMAH, I am, passionate about studying this area of Islamic law, but, I have these obligations or these family issues and these concerns, and I how do I do both? So I like to talk to students at Harvard specifically to tell them that there's a way to do both, to continue the areas that bring you joy or that you're passionate about, while also, understanding that there may be other obligations that you have that may prevent you from doing it full time. And I like to encourage people not to get frustrated and try to marry those two interests as much as possible. And they'll oftentimes find that, in the nonprofit sector, in the academic sector, there are people who are willing, if you have the time, if you have an hour or two to give, there are people who are very receptive to you giving that hour or two. So don't feel like you've had to kind of give up the passion or the interest that you have because you can't do it full time. And I've tried to do that throughout my life. And when I started at a law firm, I was like, gosh, I didn't think I was going to law school to work at a law firm and make some, protect the interest of some Fortune 100 company. And was getting very frustrated because I was like, I don't want to do this, but you know what? I have student loans and I can't afford to do the things that I'm passionate about, full time. But I found a way to kind of do both by working on, as Sarah mentioned earlier, some pro bono matters. And so, doing those things that were free. I served as a child advocate And that was a perfect opportunity, a perfect way for me to do pro bono work, because I actually realized that while I loved being a child advocate, which meant that I was going to court and helping young people in dependency court proceedings. And so in many states, I was in Pennsylvania at the time, family court actually wants to make sure that the child's interest is respected. So oftentimes we'd have the parent would have a lawyer, sometimes the mother would have a lawyer, the father would have a lawyer, and I would be the children's lawyer. But it was a great opportunity for me to kind of give back in a very community focused way to try to holistically decide what was best in the best interest of the child. But I also realized that although I loved it, I couldn't do it full time because it was very emotionally draining. So it was a great way for me to kind of do both without necessarily doing that full time, because I realized that, like, wow, this is very heavy. You know, people whose parents are oftentimes drug addicted and children who are in foster care and trying to identify what is it in the best interest for them to have family reunification or some other vehicle to preserve the family ties. But I just encourage you to look into, you know, maintaining other areas that you're interested in. And I think oftentimes, especially for Muslims, I feel that sometimes we feel that there's certain careers, right, that people's families or, you know, respects or think are, you know, most important, right? And you just may think
doctor,
that, like, God,
engineer, and then
right,
maybe lawyer. In that order.
oh no, like, what am I going to do? So sometimes a way to do that is to kind of, at least initially, do both, you know, be that engineer, that doctor, but then also maybe find a way to, if you're very interested and passionate about, you know, environmental justice, find a way to do some of that work in addition to what your kind of day job is. And oftentimes families sometimes will, over time, see the value in this career that they didn't have any information about, right? Because I mean, I think candidly, a lot of people's parents at the end of the day, they just want their children to be happy. And sometimes when they see, gosh, you don't really seem happy doing that engineer or doctor, but you always talk about this environmental justice issue, and I see you're now doing great work over there. And so sometimes just over time, you'll see that shift. And as you know, the generational shift is happening sometimes slowly, but I think that it's a good way to kind of do both, if, you know, so that you can remain interested in what your passion is.
Yeah, so, and if I can do a plug right now, you know, there are a lot of places that are crying out for poll workers, because so many of the poll workers are normally elderly people, and therefore they fall into the vulnerable category. We have this big election coming up, so that's a great way to do some work. It is paid in most states. Okay, just find out where you can go to get poll worker training, and you'll learn a bit about how the electoral system functions by doing that as well. And you don't have to do it again.
And Sarah, on that point, like, I'll share with you all, when I was at DOJ and before I even started law school, voting rights was it was like a passion of mine, right? So I did like my third year paper on, it was titled Democracy's Digital Dilemma, because I was really trying to analyze the challenges that democracy has with this, you know, kind of movement towards digital and electronic voting systems, which is now even morphed even more with respect to how democracy is being impacted by social media. But when I was at DOJ, I would oftentimes go and serve as a election monitor or observer in various jurisdictions. And I remember one time they said, Raheemah, we want you to go to Hamtramck, Michigan. And I'm like, okay.
Where the heck is that?
So Hamtramck is like right outside of Detroit. Yeah. And I think it was historically a Polish community, right? So I had like amazing Polish food, but it also now has a very large, I think specifically Yemeni and Bengali population. And so they're like, Raheemah, we need you to make sure that the ballots are in Bengali. And I'm like, okay. I'm like on Google, because I'm like, I'm Muslim, but I don't speak Bengali. So I like Google like Bengali characters, because I get to the polling place, I need to make sure the ballots are in Bengali. And like, I'm looking around, I'm like, I see this is, because oftentimes there need to be signs, right? Under the Voting Rights Act, we need to make sure that the ballots are accessible in certain jurisdictions based on their population. They are ordered to have them sometimes in Spanish. Well, in Hamtramck, they were ordered to be in Bengali. So I had to figure out exactly what Bengali was. But I say this to say that it was so important to have lawyers who were vested in ensuring that it was done right. And so I felt like maybe some of my colleagues would have taken the time to make sure, but I did research to figure out, well, okay, look, what are the Bengali characters supposed to look like? What would this sign look like in Bengali to make sure it was accurately translated? And then when I got to the polling place, where there was a community that a lot of women wore niqab. So making sure that their rights were protected, because what was happening was that, you know, some of them were getting pulled out of line and they were taken into the back. And I'm like, well, why is that woman being taken out of line and taken into the back of this room? And oh yeah, I just took her in the back. I wanted her to pull up her niqab so I could see what she looked like and check her ID. And I said, well, so we were not really supposed to interfere with elections, but I was like, wow, I don't think that there's an ID requirement for someone who's already been voting. So you didn't need to see her ID. You didn't need to see her face. And they're like, oh, you're right. So there's oftentimes so much value in us being present so we can actively, you know, ensure that people's civil rights are protected, and then B, just the physical representation of being there. There were so many women who came up to me, you know, while I'm like walking around like with my voter, you know, observer outfit on, when they heard that I was at DOJ. I mean, these aunties were like giving me hugs. They were like, oh, alhamdulillah, bless you. We're so happy you're here. Because for many people, they would come to the voting place and struggle to read the ballots in English, right? Because they thought that, like, I'm in America, I have to read in English.
Have to do it in English.
You know, if the ballot is available for you in Bengali, so that you, and because, you know, ballots with all of these initiatives that are like all these, you know, propositions, and, you know, oftentimes it's not just vote for candidate A or B. It's like, do you think that the taxation for the school district should move to A, B, C, or D? And so people are trying to digest this information in a language that is not their native language. And so having me there to say, you know, ma'am, I want you to understand this ballot is fully available in your language. And so
take your time.
Yeah, take your time. And so I think that is so important for us as Muslims to be present in all these different spaces to provide this information to people, because oftentimes people will be too uncomfortable to ask. And I want to make sure that people understand that this country has so many legal responsibilities and obligations to its people. And, you know, one of the things that I often tell people is that, you know, I was reading an article last night that was talking about African Americans in the United States, and it was basically saying, like, African Americans have been consistently fighting and protesting and struggling to hold this country to its principles, even when this country wasn't honest to those principles itself. And so I feel like that's the same for us as Muslims, to be there and be that voice for people who are not necessarily getting the full protections that they are entitled to in this country. And so I want to make sure, and I think that the more of us that are involved in these various spaces to ensure that our people are protected as they should be.
Wow. I can tell that that's something you're very, very passionate about. So tell me, so I know you're part of a very small number of African Americans working at top levels of government today. What has that experience been like for you? And is there a secret handshake?
There's no secret handshake. There's no secret handshake. And I will say that there have been throughout I think the first African-American Muslim woman, I think, was in, I want to say maybe the Carter administration.
Johnson.
Janice?
Johnson.
No, she was in Johnson. She lives here in Shaw. What's her name? Wife. Yeah, I'll get her name in a minute.
I mean, have been present for generations, right? I mean, she was there. So on one hand, I want to make sure people understand that while we are getting more and more people now, we have been present in these administrations, providing valuable resources for decades. Now, people like Jihad, people like Brother Jamil Johnson have been in Congress. And so there are Muslims who are in various aspects of the government, whether it's in the executive branch, the legislative branch. You know, we're trying to get more Muslims in the judiciary branch. And so for those who are not from, you know, in the United States, the judiciary is the judges, and the legislative branch is those who like write the laws. the Congress. And so we're trying to make sure that we're the Muslims who are on all different branches of the government. And I think one of the things that I have tried to do is to make sure that Muslims who are in the government, and I think you see it a lot more now, right? You all had a chance to meet Rashida Tlaib, and you have it with Ilhan Omar, are people who are, as I like to say, unapologetically Muslim, right? People who are, and we like to try to explain that to young people as they come and volunteer in, DC. Like we are here. People know who we are, and I think what we bring is a sense of our identity helps us, be about issues such as fairness and justice are inherently Muslim ideals, right? And so I want to make sure that people understand that, like, when I do trainings about anti-discrimination work, I'm committed not just to making sure that this is for Muslims, right? Because I'm like, my faith doesn't make me concerned about Muslims. My faith makes me concerned about addressing issues of justice and inequality, irrespective of who it applies to. And so when people begin learning and hearing more from us, they say, wow, I didn't know that. And I'm like, yeah, this is what Muslims have been, this is what Muslims are about, because these are Muslim concepts and ideas. And I also like to make sure that people understand that we're not just concerned with issues that with respect to, while the Muslim ban is extremely important, we are not only concerned about issues that involve, involve things like the Muslim ban. We're also concerned about issues such as economic justice, racial injustice. We're concerned about issues such as poverty in our communities. I mean, those are all issues that Muslims, by our very nature of our faith, are concerned about. We're concerned about issues such as the environment and how we are respectful of the environment. And so the more I like to encourage, young people, especially, to don't feel like you have to, only be about certain issues, because sometimes society at large will make you think, oh, this is what the Muslims need to be involved with. No, push back and say, yes, I am Muslim, and I'm going to be a Muslim who's advocating for Black Lives Matter, who's advocating for issues such as equal justice for all, who's advocating for issues of women's rights or environmental rights, because all of those issues comprehensively are things that we as Muslims need to be concerned about.
It's the concept of stewardship that we have, and the commandment that we should command the right and forbid the wrong. So it's really sort of part of what's in us. So was there ever an aha moment for you? Was there something that sparked this really passionate interest to become a lawyer and to focus on issues of social justice?
I don't know. I look back and it's hard for me to pinpoint like a particular moment in time. I think I think it's just one of those things that maybe from the time that I was young, I just feel like, our dinner time conversations at home, were based on not just how are you doing, and you being a great student, but really talking about like the community, like what are we doing in service to our community, and our community not just being, the Muslim community or the African American Muslim community, but like how are we engaging with humanity? And I think that that's something that just was just a natural discussion as when I was young, that just continued as I've gotten older, to make sure that that we as Muslims were engaged in all different facets of society, and that we were, concerned about others. And so I think that it just naturally became, I would be a lawyer and I would try to use my law degree kind of in service to others.
I know a little bit about your family, and what you're saying sounds so right on based on what I know about your family. I mean, clearly you were brought up in an atmosphere of service and the greater good, defined not just narrowly to the Muslim Ummah, but to humanity as a whole. So, Raheemah, looking forward, where do you see yourself in, say, 5 years or 10 years?
I think, probably remaining in the government, likely. The next step is, the top level of the career service in government is called the senior executive service. And so that's a very top, levels of government. And it's a very, intensive process to get accepted into one of those types of positions. And so I think that's probably maybe within the next 5 years. And then within the next 5 to 10 years, I do want to pursue, a career in the judiciary as a judge. I really feel like that's one of the areas that, Muslims have started making inroads in, but I think the more and more Muslims that we have at various levels of society will be, so helpful, because having that perspective will be helpful when you have people who are coming before you for whether it's civil matters or criminal matters, and being able to, be a voice for justice.
And have you considered or had the opportunity to consider a senior job, in the private sector? It seems to me like most of your work has basically been in government service of various kinds. I mean, you started in a law firm like so many people do, and then moved into government service. But have you ever considered a position, at some major corporation?
I think if I went to a major corporation, it would have to be in a capacity to do something that still allowed me to, whether it's civil rights, whether, I don't want to do a corporate role that's just about, increasing numbers. A lot of times you see a lot of positions now that are like diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a lot of these DEI positions, people get very frustrated because they feel like you're getting all these great qualified people in and, for a few years, and nothing really is changing about the business, right? And so I think if I went into a corporate role, I would want to make sure the business is really committed to addressing both internally and externally what their product is that they're selling, and both internally how their employees are faring within the company. And unless I could do both, I think that I probably wouldn't do a corporation.
Or possibly serve on a corporate board. That gives you a bit more independence, because depending on, how the parameters of your job were defined.
Well, I mean, surprisingly, someone reached out to me yesterday and wants to nominate me to be on the Yale Corporation, which is a trustee for Yale. So she's like, I really want you to do this. I'm putting your name forward. I'm on the board of governors. And so, inshallah, we'll see. But she, wants kind of that perspective of someone who has a different, view on various things on the corporation. So I looked at the corporation and I said, I would be a little bit different than most people.
True. Well, that takes me back a step, which is before you went to Harvard, you went to Yale. So do you still have active ties with Yale, other than this person who wants to nominate you to the board of the Yale Corporation?
And that's what they asked me in the on the form that I need to fill out. I've done a lot in terms of interviewing students, and I have gone back to the university to speak on various panels over the past few years, even at the college and at the law school. But that's probably the extent of my Yale, and I don't really do a lot of Yale giving. So, I mean, that's, so that would be the one thing that I think would maybe put me a little bit lower on the rank, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, we'll see. So I do have a question about so in Europe, for example, the career path to become a judge is actually very different, because most people in Europe who train to become judges go to judicial college. They go to law school, but then they get additional training to become judges. What is the normal career development path here in the United States for somebody who hopes to end up in either the state or the federal judiciary? And is there such a thing as judges college once you are appointed? There must be some way to bring people up to speed.
So yes, I do believe that most states, and I think even in the federal system, do have a judicial college once people are appointed, to kind of give them information on the nuts and bolts of the position. But there isn't anything that's similar to the European model of people actively getting training, because you will see judges, and over the past few years, you have seen a lot of federal judges who've been appointed who had a wide variety of qualifications. And I'm saying that loosely.
Yes, including being deemed, what was it, unqualified by the American viruses. Aha. Okay. Well, I suppose they bring their life experience to the position. And enough said about that because it'd be too embarrassing. Well, whew, thank you so much, Raheemah, for spending this time with me and our LLSP alumni today.
And, I want to say one thing
Sure.
before we end. So
Absolutely.
I know that many of you who are in the United States and some of you who aren't have seen and been following that, one of our esteemed congressmen, John Lewis, passed away within this past week. And we also lost another great cil rights leader named C.T. Vivian. But one thing that John Lewis said that I was just reflecting on recently, he said, do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. And he said, never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble.
Yes.
And so I think it's really important that we remember that concept, because it's easy to sometimes get frustrated that say, oh my gosh, like, especially I think some young people who've kind of grown up in this post 9/11 atmosphere, right? Like, oh my gosh, as a Muslim, like, it feels like everything is against me, and we have this and we have that, we have the Patriot Act, we have the Muslim ban, like it just seems like, but I think it's really important that we as Muslims at various ages say, this is a struggle for a lifetime. Like we know that where we as Muslims are trying to go, right? We serve Allah. We are trying to make sure that during our time here on earth, what we are concerned about is being, looking at, the examples of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So we can't get lost in the sea of despair. We have to say we have this religion, this faith that guides us, and continue on doing and kind of trying to affect change while we are here, but never letting ourselves become overwhelmed in this sense of hopelessness, because we have Islam.
Thank you for saying that. Well, the late John Lewis was kind of a personal hero to me, and I'm still dealing with not the shock, because we knew he was sick, but just our world is diminished by his loss. And he was a man who really lived his values in a way that I think we Muslims should take a lesson from. Anyway, take a breath here. Thank you. That was a wonderful way to close this session. And I don't want to close without thanking you for your service, Raheemah, to KARAMAH as co-chair of the Alumni Committee.
Thank you.
And now, for a quick look ahead, our next Lunch and Learn interview is scheduled for Thursday, the 27th of August at noon. Inshallah, I will be interviewing our newest board member, Ms. Naureen Khalif, CPA. Ms. Khalif is a participant in KARAMAH's 2020 virtual LLSP. She currently works as an associate vice president in charge of accounting at Penn Fed Credit Union. And prior to that, she worked for over 12 years at Fannie Mae. So another person who's given much of her life to service. So thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you will be here for our next Lunch and Learn on the 27th of August. Ma'as-salama to everybody, and thank you. Bye all.
Bye-bye.